When we think of artists working in wartime, we tend to imagine those who designed the propaganda. In the 20th century, the time of total war, everyone had to do their part. Men and women, professional soldiers and civilians, people from all walks of life. But the role played by artists, painters, magicians, and other professionals in the sector, in the conflicts of the century has not yet been fully explained. The story of two World War II military units, and how they were inspired by the artists who worked in World War I, gives us an insight into how they became key players in modern world warfare. For the first time, they turned the combat zone, as a scenario of creative strategy. The war literally turned into a large-scale theater. Next, the ghost army that defeated the Nazis in World War II. That is, info-ballistic. In times of peace, all artists know how to create illusions. They master the rendering of perspective, and they know how to use light and shadow to fool the eye. In times of war, artists are supposed to play a lesser role than a soldier or airman, for example. But after the First World War, the armies realized how they could benefit from the knowledge of artists, especially in the field of optical illusion. In the new era of aerial surveillance, camouflaging troops was a priority, and painters and sculptors had the talent for it, thanks to their knowledge of the use of chiaroscuro and perspective. For the first time, artistic skills became weapons. In World War I, artists such as Solomon Joseph and Leon Underwood worked on a deceptive project of an observation tree, which was a hollow log placed in no man's land, from which an observer could keep an eye on enemy trenches. Other artists who contributed to the dangerous work were Norman Wilkinson and Edward Wadsworth, who worked for the Royal Navy, with the aim of camouflaging enemy torpedo boats. These techniques were crucial to inspire the operations of said field in the Second World War. From there a new generation of artists arose, who would surpass their ancestors in dimension and magic. In 1942, in the vast and lonely furnace that was the North African desert, the Allied forces were fighting a battle against the Axis forces, made up of Germany, Italy, and Japan. On September 16, two British servicemen were summoned to a high-level meeting at Borg El Arab in Egypt. Geoffrey Barkas and Tony Ayrton were the leaders of the Camouflage Directorate of the Middle East Command, a unit dedicated to deception operations and the concealment of men and military material. Most of the men under Barkas and Ayrton's command were not battle-hardened soldiers, but artists, set designers, and cartoonists who had been recruited for their skills in visual deception. One of its members had been a famous wizard in peacetime. Ayrton was a painter, and Barkas a writer, producer and film director who won an Oscar for a documentary in 1936. After brief introductions, the men were informed of the top-secret plan to be carried out in the Second Battle of the Alamein. They were told it was an assault that could change the fate of the war, and that it would probably be the largest desert offensive in world history. Until then, the Camouflage Directorate of the Middle East Command dealt solely with camouflage tactics. They applied the same techniques that Wilkinson and Solomon had applied in the First World War, and painted the ground of the airfields with black and gray spots, simulating the shadows produced by weapons, and thus fooling the reconnaissance flights of the powers from the Axis. They also drew the roofs of the aircraft hangars, to make them look like civilian dwellings. But in September 1942, the need for more efficient magic tricks was forced upon them. For they were terrified of the mobility, tactical acumen, and firepower of their Axis adversaries, led in North Africa by commanding General Erwin Rommel. To win, they needed to catch their German and Italian enemies off guard, making them believe that the attack would come much later, and that it would come from a different direction than they expected. To achieve this, they had to camouflage entire legions of tanks in the north of the battlefield. And also to create a decoy army of 600 completely fake military vehicles in the south, to make the Axis forces fear an equally powerful attack from that flank. In what was a feat of set design, Barkas, Ayrton, and the Camouflage Directorate had just 28 days to create a fictional army and completely camouflage the real one out of sight. The fictional army of the South was created with fake tanks and food boxes, ammunition silos, and oil containers, all made of boxes and palm leaves, covered with tarpaulin. A huge fake water pipe was also built. In the northern section, the actual tanks had specially fitted wooden compartments, nicknamed sun visors, bolted to their top half, to make them look like normal trucks. Artillery pieces were similarly covered. Once in position, and immediately before the battle began, the covers were removed. It became clear to the Axis forces that they were not ready. In front of them and out of nowhere, an entire army appeared. And completely fooled, the tricks worked. After a full-scale deadly confrontation, the Allies routed Rommel's forces. After the battle, a German general admitted that the Allies had deceived them with their tactics. The artists had succeeded, and inspired others. These clever tricks inspired an American military regiment in World War II. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, better known as the Ghost Army, consisted of over 1,000 men, and were used in Europe after D-Day. Their objective was to deceive the Germans, in the same way as the camouflage leadership of the Middle East Command, into believing that forces of up to 30,000 additional troops were threatening their lines, which led them to redeploy troops to locations favorable to the Germans' allies. Like the Camouflage Directorate of the Middle East Command, the Ghost Army recruited many architects, designers, advertising creatives, and artists along with regular soldiers and engineers. Famous members of the Ghost Army included photographer Art Kane, fashion designer Bill Blass, and painter Ellsworth Kelly. During their useful life between 1944 and 1945, they carried out 22 operations to deceive the Germans, and it was instrumental in the final triumph of the Allies over Adolf Hitler. The Ghost Army used a variety of techniques to confuse. The fake military equipment included hundreds of inflatable tanks that looked from a distance exactly like the real thing, and successfully fooled German aerial reconnaissance. Another team was responsible for bogus radio traffic, intended to be intercepted by Nazi spies. A pair of mobile speakers played sounds of troop movements, and of major engineering projects like bridge building. The members of the Ghost Army also worked as actors, wearing the uniforms of different regiments, and mingling in local towns, giving hints about troop movements, hoping to be picked up by local spies. After the end of the war, the Ghost Army was sworn to secrecy, and the stories of their elaborate stage orchestration remained officially confidential until 1996. The stories of artists from World War I, the Middle East Camouflage Directorate, and America's Ghost Army reveal a new direction in the history of illusionism in art. Although artists had occasionally been used by the military before the 20th century, when recording the topography of enemy positions, for example, modern warfare had involved artists' optical tricks in entirely original ways. His work on strategic diversion of attention was critical to the overall war effort, reminding us that deception, as Sun Tzu wisely observed, back in the 5th century BC, is always the key element in the art of war. This was Info Ballistic.